Today, I'm gonna talk about sex. That's my job. I get paid to go around the world and talk about sex. But I'm not talking about the good kind of sex. I'm talking about the dark, the shaming, the shameful kind of sex. My job is to talk about sexual violence in times of war. Rape, forced pregnancy, forced prostitution, sexual enslavement. My job is to break the taboos that too often prevent us from acting. Everything started when I was a student. I wrote my master thesis on rape and forced pregnancy as international crime. I read hundreds of documents and testimonies, watched videos and immersed myself in these horrors for months. Men being forced to rape their brothers, women being sexually enslaved, or children being abducted by fighters and then gang raped. Dreadful and atrocious beyond words. But I was okay, because you learn how to protect yourself and you find your own coping mechanisms. I continued in this direction for more than 2 years, working at the international tribunals, first for former Yugoslavia and then for Rwanda. And there, every day, I listened to awful stories about sexual violence and other crimes. But I was still okay. Until one day, during a field visit in Congo, in a northern part of Kivu, working with the International Committee of the Red Cross, I had an encounter that changed everything. Accompanied by a psychologist, I met with a victim of sexual violence, as I had done many times before. Let's call her Mathilde. Mathilde was a 55 years old woman, but she looked like 70. She had deep wrinkles on her face, and she was very skinny. The expression in the eyes was dead. Without even looking at us, she began a story about what had happened a few days before. While she was harvesting with her husband in a field, fighters arrived. They killed him right in front of her with the machetes and cut him into pieces before raping her several times. She told the story very calmly. Her eyes were empty. She had no tears, there were no screams. And what struck me the most was her humility and deep sadness on her face. She was still alive, but I felt as if she was dead. And like many other survivors of sexual violence around the world, Mathilde carried guilt. Guilt for what happened to her and her husband, and guilt for still being alive. She was also very scared that her village and community would blame and reject her. So after losing her husband and feeling she had lost her dignity, she was scared of losing her home and community. There came a moment where I felt totally overwhelmed by what I had just heard. All the horrors I had read about, watched through documentaries, or faced in the field was there, all contained within her one story. And I'm telling you this story because this encounter changed my life and the way I approach the issue of sexual violence. Given Mathilde courage to tell her story despite her fear, her guilt, her shame, I understood that we would never be able to approach victims of sexual violence and encourage them to come forward as long as sexual violence would remain such a sensitive and taboo issue everywhere. And the change had to start with me. I had to pass from observer to actor. And I did. On that day, I broke my own fears and taboos about talking about sexual violence. And today, my job is to plant seeds of change, hoping and expecting that those who receive these seeds will plant theirs in return. Because this is a collective mission to shatter the taboo on a global scale and shift the blame from victims to perpetrators. But this is challenging. Many of us feel embarrassed to talk about sex out loud with others. And it's even worse to talk about sexual violence because it mixes cruelty, violence with intimacy. It's like talking about death. We get awkward, we find it difficult to muster up the courage and go to talk to someone who has lost a loved one. And why this? Because it's intimate and private, because it seems inappropriate, because we don't know what to say and we don't know how the person will react. And also because it's rooted in the education and traditions that have shaped us. Many of us also carry preconceptions about sexual violence. We have all heard people, directly or indirectly, blaming victims of sexual violence for what happened to them. All these women should not complain about being raped if they were dressed in such an inappropriate way, as it's a call for sex. Or this man there who has been raped, maybe he asked for it. Maybe he's not entirely heterosexual and has homosexual tendencies. I've heard many similar reactions all over the world. We must not forget that sexual violence is indeed the only violation for which victims are blamed for what happened. But these taboos and these preconceptions result in serious consequences for victims. In many conflicts where we work, South Sudan, Central Africa, Congo, Colombia or Syria, being a victim of sexual violence means automatic rejection, stigmatization, or isolation. And the ones who dare to come forward can face reprisals, sometimes leading to death, being killed either by the perpetrators or by their own family for honor. I've reflected myself many times. What would I do if I were myself a victim of sexual violence? Would I go and seek care at the hospital? Would I share my story with my friends or my family? With my neighbors or my colleagues? I would probably not. And you in this room most likely would not either. Many of us would probably remain silent and hide what happened. And why? Because we would feel too ashamed. Because we would fear being judged, looked at, questioned, or blamed. And these are the main reasons why sexual violence continues to be an invisible phenomenon, and why so few victims come forward to seek care, help, or justice. Apart from knowing that sexual violence knows no color, continent, or culture, and that it occurs in most wars, we know very little about its scale because it's severely underreported. Even basic evidence, data, statistics are missing. And the one we have only show the tip of the iceberg. So the only way to change this is to start talking about sexual violence. This is the important first steps towards deconstructing the taboos and shifting the blame from victims to perpetrators. A few months ago, I talked to a group of 30 male combatants from a Middle Eastern country about sexual violence as a war crime. It was the first time we engaged with them on this issue. And it was kind of new too for them, because they were about to discuss something with a sexual connotation, with a stranger, a woman who was white and non-Muslim, myself. I could have been intimidated, but I chose to be direct and to talk without embarrassment while using appropriate language. So of course, I can't say whether I will have an impact on their behavior when they are back to the battlefield. But what I'm sure of is that I help them to break their own barriers and discomfort to talking about sexual violence. Because they discussed, they participated, they raised their hand, and they reacted. And because a few men at the end of the session came to thank me for talking about it so openly, as it helped them to realize what really sexual violence means for both the victims and the perpetrators. So the message I would like to leave with you today is that we all have a role to play, whether we are a specialist or not. Because sexual violence is not unspeakable, and survivors like Mathilde deserve that we pronounce the words sexual violence and talk about it fearlessly. And it begins with us, who have the means to be vocal. Humanitarian workers, politicians, academics, the media, and all of you listening to this talk, no matter who and where you are. And only then will we really encourage victims of sexual violence to come forward, and will we dare and be able to influence those with the power to eradicate this horrendous crime. So I challenge you to start the conversation right now, and why not in this very room? We all owe that to Mathilde. Thank you.